and running.
Are we ready? Is it running now?
It's running now. Whatever you feel comfortable talking about, some of your experiences, and they'll prompt you.
Well, Mike, you have asked me, being a veteran of World War II, some of my experiences in that war. I want to tell you that I came from the Ticonderoga High School, and when I was a junior in 1940, the war came on. The local National Guard unit was mobilized, and so the New York State decided they would put in place a New York State Guard unit to take its place. I joined that when I was a junior in high school, and I spent 2 years in the training that we had down in our armory down here in Ticonderoga. It was interesting. For 2 years, we went to field training, taking care of knowing how to shoot a rifle and all of the rest of that goes with basic training in the military forces. Upon graduation in 1942, I thought that I'd had enough training, and my parents gave me permission to enlist in the United States Army Air Corps. It was not the Air Force, but the Army Air Corps. I went to Albany, took the allegiance to the flag and to the Constitution of the United States, and was shipped, of all places, to Atlantic City, where the Army Air Corps had confiscated all these hotels down there. And there I took training, which I really didn't need, but I took the basic training that they had, and I asked to become, because I enlisted, I asked to become a machinist in the ground forces of our Air Corps. It was approved. I went to Chanute Air Force Base, which is in Illinois. I spent approximately 4 months there, training in the use of machines and lathes, milling machines and shapers and so forth. Upon graduation then, units were being formed by the Air Corps. One of the units that I went into, we got on the trains and rode around the country until finally we came to Fort Kilmer in New Jersey. We stayed there for about 2 weeks, and then we boarded a beautiful liner for overseas. It turned out to be the Queen Mary, and you have seen the model that I have here in my home. There were 15,000 of us young people, and I might say that most of us were about 18, 19, or 20 years old. We thusly took off from New York, the New York Harbor, and for 6 days and 7 nights, we traversed the Atlantic Ocean through the infested German U-boats that were out there sinking anything that came by. But and the Queen Mary was one of those that went about 32 knots. And that was really speedy because it could outdo the submarines and so forth. We landed in the aircraft, or the Queen Mary came into Ayr, Scotland. There, the troops, myself, we went into lighters, got onto the land surface, boarded trains, and for about a day and a half we ran up and down England, and from where I don't know, but we landed in southern England, at a replacement depot that was starting to set up by U.S. military units. The replacement was there. I lasted about a week there before I was assigned to a British airdrome up by Bury St. Edmunds. I went up there with a contingent of U.S. troops, soldiers, and we finally got our base to where we were, and ultimately a lot of military construction was going on because we were transferring it into a U.S. Air Force base. This, it was then designated as the first strategic air depot, United States Army Air Corps, and we called it the first SAD, Strategic Air Corps Depot. This was my home for the remainder of the time that I was in England. We worked 10 and 12 hours a day. We watched the first times that we first got on there, we were invaded by the Nazi Air Force, and it came over at nighttime, giving us flares and so on and so forth. But they didn't drop any bombs near us, but it was further away. So those were some of the scares that we incurred and so forth during this period of time. The 8th Air Corps was composed completely of B-17s known as the Flying Fortress. The Flying Fortress was one of those, it got its name because it was a flying fortress. It had the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, the bombardier. It had gunners in the tail on the two sides, down in the belly, and so forth. It was a fortress, and so forth. It took many casualties, but it gave many casualties to the Nazi air forces that came against it. They were heavy bombers. Their mission was to bomb the targets in Germany and some in France, some that were set up in Holland and Belgium. Those were selected targets there along the coastline. But in the interior, they bombed Berlin, ultimately Hanover, and the industrial Ruhr, which was where the Nazis had their tanks, they had their aircraft units, aircraft manufacturing, and so forth, and so forth. I can only say that we saw a lot of bombers come back, tails that were halved off, holes in the wings and so on, but these flying fortresses almost, and as some of the pilots we talked to, they said, these bombers will fly by themselves. And so, some of them, and in the depot that we were at, we repaired, we manufactured parts that were not in the system, the logistic system. And that was one of the missions of the machinists, of the heat treating guys that were right next to us, the prop guys that did the work on props and repaired them, got them balanced and so forth. So we were a group of specialists that took care of when a bomber came down, it was analyzed that these were the things that were necessary. The mechanics went to it. They brought back stuff and said, hey, we need this helical gear, or we need this, or we need that. That was our job. And I reiterate again, we spent 10 and 12 hours a day, 2 shifts. And I always took the back one, which was the night shift all the way through. For one reason, and you can smile on this, because every 6 months we were authorized a 5-day leave. It was called a furlough. And so when we got off duty in the morning, some of us guys that got those 5 and 6 day passes or furloughs, we would shower and run like heck to get on those leaves and go to wherever we were. Some of us went to London, some of us went to Edinburgh, Scotland, others went to Inverness and so forth. I was one of those that didn't particularly stay in the big cities. Because of my training here and my mom and dad, I was always a very silent type of an individual, and I went to the little small towns, and where in some places I went that they'd never seen an American soldier. And it was interesting because they opened their doors to you. Come on in, Yank. Have some tea with us. And I got to like tea pretty well. So anyway, that was the period of time in World War II that I spent with the Army Air Corps. Now, in some of your questions you ask, how did you come back and so forth? I want to say when we were waiting to be, the troops in England were waiting to get on boats that were made available so that we could get on and come back to the United States. The military forces set up what was known as Birmingham American University. It was one of those universities where professors came from the United States over, and they were mighty fine guys. And they set up a university, and while I was waiting, I didn't know when I was going to get on a ship, I signed up for it. And I spent approximately 4 months, and I took 3 courses, which ultimately I passed and so forth, mathematics and English and history and so forth, which ultimately, when I took the GI Bill of Rights, when I got home, which was available to me to go to college, those credits that I got from that Birmingham American University were given into the University of Illinois, where I went to the College of Engineering and ultimately graduated. And so that was a period of time that was available to all soldiers, so I took the opportunity to do that, to start educating, because that is what I knew ultimately I wanted to go to college and so forth. When I received orders to go to Southampton to come home, we were supposedly, the group that I was with, we were supposed to come home on the USS Wasp, which was an aircraft carrier. Mm-hmm. But there was a problem with the Wasp, and so we waited another 2 weeks until where we were in Southampton. I looked out and I saw this aircraft carrier out there. And I said, oh boy, this was the aircraft carrier that we were supposed to come home to. It had been retrofitted to take care of not the aircraft or anything else, but when you got on, you were in the lower decks, and they had A-frames like this with bunks that were for the troops like myself, and so on and so forth. They allowed us to walk around and so forth. And one of the great surprises on this aircraft that I was on, I happened to walk by in the main section on this lower deck was a commemorative in metal. It said the USS Lake Champlain. And I said, oh my God, I'm from Ticonderoga, where Champlain is here and Lake George is here, and that's the thing of what Ticonderoga means. It means the city between two lakes. But I started reading, and there was a Grant Johnson's name on there, who was one of the representatives to the state government from our Ticonderoga here, and he was, when the USS Lake Champlain was christened, he was one of the representatives from Ticonderoga, and I knew him and so forth. So there was a great compassion in my breast to feel that I was going home on a vessel that was so close to my home. It took 6 days. We came into New York Harbor. We saw the ladies standing there, and it brings a real chest analogy, and to be home safe and sound. We offloaded and we went to Fort Dix, which was the replacement depot for us for our getting back into civilian life. I processed through. I came over to New York because that's the transportation that would lead me up to Albany and then into Ticonderoga and so forth. I got to Grand Central Station and got on the Delaware and Hudson, the Laurentian. And after a couple of hours on that, we finally got to Albany, and then we waited for a few more hours, and then I took the train, the Delaware and Hudson, to Ticonderoga, and it was on its way up to Canada. It was a surprise to me that when we stopped in Ticonderoga, and of course the station is not there anymore, but it was right across from where there is the Fort View Inn, or the restaurant there. This train station was on that butt of land that is right there and so forth. I got off the train and I had my barracks bag, and I guess I had another barracks bag too, because that was the military uniforms and everything else that I had accumulated and they gave me. So as the train took off and was going north and so forth, I had to look over the tracks, and there was a taxi there. And this is important. To me it is, anyway. And I said, can I get a ride to Ty? And the guy said, yes, you can. And the taxi driver happened to be Mr. Tony Fortino, elderly gentleman. And he says, oh, he was a taxi driver in Ticonderoga for many, many years. And he said, I'm waiting at this taxi at the train at 4 o'clock in the morning, every morning, to see you chaps coming home. And he said, hiya, Breed. And he recognized who I was and so forth. And he took me home. and I got home at 4:30 in the morning. I rapped on the front door, and I awakened my mom and dad, and it was a joyous occasion to come home, see your mom and dad. And I had both arms and both legs. My physical aspect was in tip-top shape, and I was not like one of those that comes home on stretchers and comes home from the wars that are dastardly. And my friend Charlie Roos, who lives across or comes back over, he was one of those that spent his time in Europe during the war, Battle Bulge. Got his Purple Heart. He's well now, but he spent many months in the hospitals in England and in Walter Reed Army Hospital before he was discharged, and so forth. He came here, and I see him all the time when he comes back from Florida on his vacation. It's always nice to come home, particularly to Ticonderoga, which is a small community where you grew up, you went to school, you have friends here, and so forth. You realize that the United States is a very powerful nation, and I can tell you from years later, I spent the 30 years of my military life in many areas of the country and of the world, and there ain't nothing like coming home. And that's one of the reasons I have retired here. My wife and I retired at this place here because it belonged to my aunt and uncle, and it belonged to me now. So I cannot tell you any more unless I think and a half over there in their country. We went in places where no men, no Yanks had ever been, but they certainly opened their hearts to us. And what a staunch people those English were. And they took it from the Nazis and they gave it back to them in full measure with our help with the 8th United States Army Air Corps. Don't turn it. Are we ready?
It's recording.
You have asked me, Mike, to try to illustrate what the English people went through in the very beginning. Now remember, World War II started in 1938. They really weren't prepared for what was coming on. The Nazis, or the Germans, they had an air force of over 5,000 airplanes. Now, a little incident that I read about when I was roughly your age was Charles Lindbergh was invited to the German armed forces, and he recognized the air force that Germany had. Its modern Messerschmitts, its Deutner bombers, and so forth. This one here. He came back to Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and he said, the German Air Force is a unique Air Force of 5,000 aircraft, and they're producing more. Roosevelt didn't really believe him, but it turned out that way. When 1938 came, one of the strategic goals of Germany was to try and subjugate England. And so they started what was a blitz. It was their Air Force with all its might of bombers, of fighters, reconnaissance aircraft. They targeted London and the outskirts of England, Manchester, one of the industrial areas, and so forth. I happened, when I got over there and got a 3-day pass, I thought I would go to London, to Piccadilly Circus, to see Nelson on his statue, and all of the things that I had read about London. The Red Cross, the American Red Cross, had set up in one of the blocks a canteen and an area where guys like myself visiting London could walk in there, sign in, get a bed, and stay the night or the 3 days that you were in London. You always had a place to go, you always had a place to sleep. One of the times that I visited London on a 3-day pass, the Germans came over in force with their air forces. It isn't, you can hear those bombers, they have a particular whine and so forth. The British, in their anti-aircraft batteries that were around London, started firing and so forth and so on. When you go outside, like I did, it was nothing more than a 4th of July like we have had in our own hometown here, where the skyrockets go up and the boom, boom, boom. The Germans came over, they dropped their incendiaries. Now, if you know what an incendiary is, it is a stick of bomb that when it hits, it ignites. And it is phosphorus, which is a very hot piece of fire. It goes down through concrete, it goes down through wood like pow. This time I envisioned and felt the bombers going over and just not only dropping incendiaries to know where they were, but they dropped bombs. When the Germans had gotten across London at that time, and as they generally did, they went up over by Bury St. Edmunds and Ipswich and then back over Holland and back into their airdromes. I went back to sleep, thinking I was going to sleep. But we Yanks found that there was a fire going on in the Red Cross building, and so we all went, and it was an incendiary, and so we were in that building. There were pots of sand and so forth. Now sand, if you can find an incendiary, you put sand on it, so you cut out the oxygen, then you got it. It'll stop. So we were fighting these things throughout that building. But the next day, I started walking around where fire engines were, where the English people were fighting fires of untold numbers. I observed one of the blocks in London was completely decimated. The people that were there, or hopefully they got out, but I don't know. But there were all sorts of fire engines, there were all sorts of ambulances, there was all sorts of this type trying to dig out, do what they could to find out what happened on that particular building that was decimated. This is the way England fought, not only in London, but throughout London. You would walk along some of the streets and all of a sudden there'd be nothing there. It would... The Nazis, or the Germans, did a tremendous job on London and some of the other manufacturing cities in the Northland of England. But they fought back. That is one of the reasons I just almost married a girl over there. But seriously, those people were such staunch people. They had very little in rationing and all of this stuff to live and so on. They were fighting these Germans in the very first part and also throughout the 43, 44, 45 with us and so forth. If you look at the landing in France, you had the Canadian First Army, you had the Brits, you had us and us and us. I won't say that the British would ever have capitulated. They would have fought to the last shell that they had. Winston Churchill said, "We will fight on our beaches, we will fight on our cities and so on, but we will not give up." And so they were. That's the way they did. I have great admiration for the Brits, as I had, and I did have admiration, and I will have admiration for the Australians. They are a fighting bunch. I got to know some of those guys, particularly in the Australian Air Forces that were joined us. Every once in a while they'd miss us. They would miss there and come in and come into our airport, our strategic air depot. And they used to say, "Oh my God, I'm sorry, I got the wrong airport." So my time in World War II was not blood and guts. That became later in my career with the Army and in the Armed Forces of our United States. Is that, this must be the invasion. And then down in our first sergeant, he come bounding out of there, you know, and with a word, you know, and he went from hutment to hutment to hutment, you know, and our first sergeant, he says, "It's on, it's on, it's on," you know. Everybody get up and go. We reported back to our sections and so forth. Of course, we had weapons, you know. I had a Thompson submachine gun, 45 caliber machine gun with the bullets and the 50 caliber bullets and so on and so forth. And we all got out with our guns and everything else, you know, just in case something happened. But this is what happened with the first sergeant says, "Come on, get your weapons up, let's go, you know, we're going to go out and mobilize," and so on and so forth. And then we went back to our normal operations, and I wouldn't say normal operations. because we knew that there was going to be tragedy all the way along, you know, and so forth. But that was another one of those things that just popped through my mind, that for blitzkrieging, we reversed the blitzkrieging and so forth. And we started bombing Berlin and the Ruhr Valley. And after it was all over, as I might have said, after it was all over, some of us ground forces, we were asked, hey, would you like to take a ride in a B-17 and go over Europe where we were to see and so on and so forth. I signed up, yeah, I said wanted to go, you know, being about 19 years old and full of vim, vigor, and vitality. So we got in there, and 6 hours later we came back to our air depot. But we went over Hanover and some of those, and I mean, Frankfurt was another place. There was nothing standing and so forth. Then we flew over flew over Paris, and there was the Eiffel Tower there, and I had to go and urinate. And you're not supposed to tell anybody this, but I'll tell you, you're old enough to know. In the bombers, they had the urinating tubes, you know, and so I peed on Eiffel Tower. No one's supposed to know that, but I did. And I said, "There, you Frenchman." I never liked the Frenchman either, even though when I was in Indochina. But anyway,
Did your work?
we're in close formation, because in close formation, if you recognize where you were, then when you were attacked by fighters, they couldn't get into the interior of your formation. Just on the outsides, you know. And when you look at a B-17, if you look at my model out there, you see it is a fortress. The 50 calibers, the way they are, in the tail, the two sides, the bond, up in the front. Hey, geez, that was a firepower and a half. If one of them went across a formation like this, those guys would put up 50 caliber like this if a attack aircraft went across. I mean, they were shooting those down. But once when bombers went down, and those that came into our depot, I mean, they were really shut up, you know, but all sorts of stuff there, you know, and of course there was many of the gunners were wounded, killed, so on. But the way, in answer to your question, the formations that were made by the hierarchy, they tried to keep in groupings so that they couldn't be attacked, you know, singly.
Do you indicated you have copies of some of those mission reports?
Some films and movies and so forth that show, I can remember seeing one movie there, you know, and where a bomber was going along, and all of a sudden its wing just collapsed and it went up like this, you know, and went right down. Now, on that maneuver there, they ain't no one going to get out of that airplane, and so you've lost 8 men right there, you know. The casualties were great. There was no minimum. They were maximum casualties on almost every mission that the 8th Air Force flew.
Did you handle bombs?
No. I did not, no, I did not, no, that was the armorers and so forth. That was a different segment there. And at the depot, we did not have the munitions to take to an aircraft and arm it up, or no, we were in the depot operations.